The rain was relentless, cascading down in heavy sheets that blurred the winding road ahead. Alex squinted through the windshield, trying to make out anything familiar. All he saw were shadows of towering trees and thick fog creeping across the road. His phone had died miles ago, and his GPS had taken him on some detour that didn't appear to lead back to any highway. When he finally spotted a dim, flickering sign up ahead, he exhaled in relief. Miller's Motel. The sign read, the M and E barely clinging to the rusty frame. It didn't look like much, but a roof over his head was better than being stranded in the storm. Alex parked and made a run for the front office, water dripping from his jacket as he shook it off. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old carpet and something stale, like mildew that had been sitting too long. "Can I help you?" A man's voice broke the silence. Alex turned and saw an older man behind the counter, his eyes shadowed and face expressionless. The name tag on his chest read Earl. There was something unnerving about the way Earl looked at him, his gaze lingering a bit too long. Yeah," Alex stammered, shifting under Earl's stare. "I need a room for the night. Just one night." Earl's thin lips cracked into a slight smile. "Sure thing, son. Got one left. Room 9. He slid an ancient-looking key across the counter. Alex took it, his fingers brushing against Earl's cold, calloused hands. Earl's skin felt oddly damp, as if he hadn't dried off in days. "Enjoy your stay and lock the door," Earl said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine as he left the office. Earl's words echoed in his mind. He shook it off, blaming his nerves on the rain and exhaustion. Room 9 was on the far side of the building, tucked in a dark corner where the single overhead light flickered weakly. The room was small and dated, with faded wallpaper peeling in the corners. The smell of damp wood lingered in the air, mixed with something metallic. He brushed it off, setting his bag down on the bed and taking in his surroundings. The mattress creaked under his weight, springs groaning in protest. With a sigh, he kicked off his shoes, threw his wet jacket over a chair, and lay back, letting exhaustion wash over him. But just as he began to doze off, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic scratching against the wall. He sat up, listening, the hairs on his arms standing on end. It sounded like fingernails dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. "Just the rain," he whispered to himself, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. With a jolt, he got up, pressing his ear to the wall. The scratching stopped, but now there was something else, a faint, muffled whisper. "Help me." The voice was so soft he almost thought he imagined it. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. Silence. He backed away from the wall, his pulse racing. He tried to laugh it off. The room was old. It was probably just the pipes creaking or something. He lay back down, but sleep didn't come. Every so often, he could swear he heard it again, a scratch, a whisper, something just beyond his understanding. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he sat up and grabbed his phone instinctively, only to remember it was dead. He decided to confront Earl, thinking maybe the old man had some idea about the strange sounds. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, casting an eerie quiet over the parking lot. The lights from the motel office were dim, and when Alex entered, he found the room empty. Earl was nowhere to be seen, and the office was deathly silent. "Earl?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. He started back to his room, the unease growing into something sharper. That's when he saw it. At the far end of the motel, just past room 9, there was a shadow moving in the darkness. It was faint, but unmistakable. A figure pacing back and forth in front of the last door. "Hello?" Alex called, his voice wavering. The figure froze, then slowly turned towards him. The overhead light flickered, and for a split second, Alex saw a face. Pale, hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. His heart thundered in his chest as he stumbled back, almost tripping over his own feet. He turned and bolted for his room, his only thought to lock himself inside, to put some barrier between him and whatever he'd seen. He slammed the door shut, twisting the lock, his breaths coming in rapid gasps. The room felt even colder now, the air thick with a strange, suffocating silence. He fumbled with his bag, looking for anything to defend himself, but his hands were shaking too much. Then he heard it again. "Help me." The voice was louder this time, coming from right outside his door. He held his breath, listening. Soft footsteps shuffled past his door, slow and uneven, as if whoever or whatever was dragging a heavy weight. He clenched his fists, waiting, praying it would pass. But the footsteps stopped and a shadow fell across the bottom of the door. A moment later, a raspy voice whispered through the crack, low and pleading, "Don't open it. Don't let him in." The voice was followed by another whisper, colder, crueler. "Let me in, Alex." His heart stopped. How did they know his name? Panic surged through him, and he backed away from the door, pressing himself against the far wall. The door handle jiggled, slowly at first, then harder, more insistent. Bang! The sound of a fist pounding against the door reverberated through the room. "Let me in, Alex," the voice growled, more menacing now. "You don't want to know what happens if you don't." He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His eyes were fixed on the door as it buckled under the weight of something trying to force its way in. He felt trapped, cornered, and the reality of his helplessness was crushing. The door cracked open, just a sliver, and a cold, bony hand snaked through, stretching toward him. He watched, paralyzed, as the hand reached further down the skin stretched tight over bone, fingers curling as if to beckon him. Desperation took over. In one last surge of strength, he ran to the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. He pressed himself against the door, waiting, hoping it would hold. For what felt like hours, he listened to the silence, broken only by his own shallow breaths. Eventually, the pounding stopped. Silence fell once again. Alex dared to crack the door open, peering into the room. It was empty. The only trace of what happened was his key, lying on the floor by the door, wet and cold. The next morning, when he stumbled into the office to check out, a different man was at the counter, one Alex had never seen. I didn't see Earl around last night," he stammered, unsure of what to say. The man's face went pale. Earl? Earl died 10 years ago," he said, glancing nervously at room 9. "And no one's checked into that room in a long time, after what happened there." He didn't wait to hear the rest. Without a word, he grabbed his keys and left, vowing never to speak of Miller's Motel again. As Sarah drove along the desolate mountain road, the thick fog hung like a ghostly veil over the forest. She had been on the road for hours, and her destination seemed no closer. The headlights barely pierced the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Just as she was about to turn back, a weathered sign caught her eye. "Hawksmoor Inn. Vacancy." With relief, she turned into the narrow gravel driveway, leading to a towering Victorian-style building. It looked ancient, dark shingles missing in places, the walls covered in ivy. It was hardly inviting, but it was a place to rest. She parked and stepped out, clutching her coat as a chill seeped into her bones. The silence was eerie, as though the place were holding its breath. Sarah reached the front door and knocked. After a moment, it creaked open by itself, revealing a dimly lit foyer lined with antique furniture and dusty chandeliers. A woman in her 70s appeared from behind the counter, her pale face drawn and hollow. "You're traveling alone?" she asked, her voice brittle and thin. "Yes. Is there a room available?" The woman hesitated, her gaze drifting over Sarah as if studying her. "Room 17 is open. It's at the end of the hall. But," she added, her voice barely a whisper, "lock the door and don't answer if someone knocks after midnight." Sarah felt a twinge of unease but brushed it off, assuming it was just the woman's eccentricity. She thanked her, took the brass key, and made her way down the dimly lit hallway, feeling as though the shadows were watching her. Room 17 was at the very end of the hall, its door marked by peeling paint. Inside, it was dated but clean, with a single bed, an old dresser, and a large mirror on the wall. She closed the door and locked it, setting her things down as she tried to shake off the strange feeling gnawing at her. As she lay down, exhausted, she could hear the wind howling outside. But as the hours passed, she realized it wasn't just the wind she was hearing. There were faint footsteps in the hall, slowly pacing back and forth. She checked the clock, 12:45 a.m. "It's just another guest," she told herself, trying to calm her racing heart. But then the footsteps stopped, directly outside her door. The silence was so heavy that Sarah held her breath, waiting. A soft knock echoed through the room. The knock was so gentle, it almost sounded like a child's hand tapping on the door. Her mind raced with the old woman's warning, "Don't answer if someone knocks after midnight." She ignored it, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her pulse thundering. A few moments passed in silence, and she thought it was over. But then, the knock came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock, knock. She sat up, clutching her blanket, willing herself to stay silent. Her eyes drifted toward the mirror, and that's when she froze. Reflected in the glass was not her own face, but the pale, twisted face of a little girl. Her eyes hollow, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she realized the girl was staring back at her, unblinking. Why? Won't you let me in? The girl's voice whispered, not from outside the door, but from within the mirror. Sarah scrambled back, pressing herself against the headboard, unable to tear her gaze from the horrifying reflection. She watched as the girl slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass from the other side. Then the knocking on the door started again, louder and more desperate. Knock! 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 Please, let me in. I'm so cold, the voice whispered, echoing from every corner of the room now, chilling Sarah to her core. She shut her eyes, covering her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, filling her head until she could barely think. In a moment of desperate courage, she bolted out of bed and ran to the door, intending to unlock it and escape down the hall. But as her hand touched the doorknob, she felt something icy and wet, like a hand grabbing her wrist. She gasped and pulled away, turning to find the girl now standing behind her, her face inches from Sarah's, her breath ice cold and smelling of damp earth. Let me in. The girl's voice was hollow, eyes wide and blank as they bore into Sarah's. With a scream, Sarah yanked the door open, running down the hallway as fast as she could. The hotel was dark and silent, the shadows seeming to twist and move as she fled. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, small, quick, pattering along the floor. She reached the lobby, but it was empty. The old woman was gone, the counter abandoned. In her panic, she ran outside, her footsteps crunching on the gravel as she stumbled toward her car. She scrambled inside and locked the doors, heart pounding as she started the engine, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. In the mirror, she could see the little girl standing at the entrance to the inn, her head tilted, her eyes following Sarah. As Sarah reversed, she saw a line of shadowy figures emerge from the doorway, standing behind the girl, each one more twisted and spectral than the last. Their faces were blank, mouths open in silent wails as they raised their hands, reaching out toward her. Sarah floored the gas, speeding down the gravel road, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. When she finally looked back, the inn had disappeared into the mist, as though it had never been there. Days later, when she tried to find Hawksmoor Inn on a map, there was no trace of it. No record, no address, nothing. Just an empty stretch of road where the inn should have been. But every night since then, Sarah wakes to a soft knocking on her bedroom door at midnight. Knock, knock, knock. The old woods had a reputation for swallowing people whole. Locals claimed it was cursed, a place where you could hear whispers in the trees and see shadows darting between the trunks. But Max didn't believe in ghost stories. He'd grown up hearing them, dismissing the tales as superstition. So when his friends dared him to spend a night alone at the center of the woods, he accepted without a second thought. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and his phone, Max set off into the dense forest just before dusk. The trees towered over him, blocking out most of the fading light, their twisted branches intertwining like skeletal hands. As he walked deeper, he felt the weight of the silence pressing in on him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. After about an hour, he reached the clearing, a strange bare patch in the middle of the woods. It was said to be where they lived. The ghosts, or spirits, or whatever the locals believed haunted the place. There he set up his small camp, his only light, the flashlight, casting eerie shadows around him. Night fell quickly, swallowing the forest in pitch-black darkness. The only sounds now were the wind and the occasional crackle of twigs as creatures scurried through the underbrush. But just as Max was starting to settle, he heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound that made his skin crawl. Tap, tap, tap! It was coming from the trees surrounding the clearing, a slow, deliberate tapping like someone knocking on wood. He brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch swaying in the wind. But the tapping grew louder, closer as if circling him. His heart beat faster, and he gripped his flashlight, shining it around. Nothing, only trees. Hello? He called, forcing a laugh. Is someone out there? The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Pressing in from every side, he felt a cold breeze, colder than the autumn air should have been, sending a shiver down his spine. Then, from somewhere behind him, a soft whisper drifted through the clearing. Max, He froze. The voice sounded like a child's, soft and pleading. How did they know his name? Who's there? He called, trying to keep his voice steady. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a pale shape, just barely visible. He pointed his flashlight at it, but the figure was gone. His hands shook as he tried to calm his breathing, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But then he heard it again, louder this time. Max, help me. The voice was closer now, coming from all directions, echoing through the clearing. He stumbled backward, the beam of his flashlight jittering as he struggled to hold it steady. And then he saw them. Figures began to emerge from the trees, pale and gaunt, their faces blank and hollow-eyed. They moved in slow, jerky steps, their limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Their clothes were tattered and filthy, as if they had been lost in the woods for years. And their eyes were black pits, empty and soulless. Max's heart pounded as he backed away, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't. But these things, they were real, and they were closing in on him, their expressions vacant yet filled with an inexplicable hunger. Please, one of them whispered, reaching out a twisted, bony hand. We're so cold. He turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks as he made his way back through the trees. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic set in, his breaths coming in sharp gasps as he struggled to navigate the maze of trees. Behind him, he could hear them, slow, shuffling footsteps and whispers that grew louder with each step he took. Max, don't leave us, they pleaded, their voices filling his ears, almost drowning out his own thoughts. He ran faster, pushing through branches that scratched his face and tore at his clothes. Every time he glanced back, they were closer, their pale forms barely visible in the moonlight, hands outstretched as if to drag him back into the woods. Finally, he saw a faint light ahead, the edge of the woods, safety. He sprinted toward it, his lungs burning, his legs aching. But just as he reached the clearing's edge, he tripped, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, and he scrambled to get up, his eyes wide with terror as he heard the footsteps closing in. A figure loomed over him, its face twisted and hollow, eyes wide and filled with an unearthly sorrow. It knelt down, reaching out a hand, cold and bony, inches from his face. Stay with us, it whispered, its voice like the wind. With a final burst of strength, Max pushed himself up and limped the last few steps out of the forest. The moment he crossed the boundary, the whispers stopped, the air went still, and the figures vanished as if they had never been there. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, his entire body shaking. He looked back at the woods, half expecting to see those pale faces staring back at him. But there was nothing, only trees and shadows. Max never spoke of that night, never told his friends about the things he had seen. But every night after, he would wake up to the sound of tapping on his window, followed by a faint, ghostly whisper. Max, don't leave us. We're so cold. When Emily moved into the old Victorian house on Willow Street, she thought she'd found the perfect home. It had charm, history, and space, a far cry from the cramped apartments she was used to. She loved the old, creaky floors and the intricate wood-carved banisters, but something about the house felt off. From the day she moved in, Emily noticed strange things. The lights flickered, even though the wiring had been updated. The air always felt heavy, carrying a damp, earthy smell, like soil, and every so often she would hear a soft, scratching noise in the walls. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, she went to bed, barely able to keep her eyes open. Sometime around midnight, she was startled awake by a noise coming from downstairs. A faint, rhythmic creak, like someone was slowly rocking in a chair. She lay there, holding her breath, listening. The creaking continued, unchanging, until curiosity finally got the better of her. She slipped out of bed, her footsteps soft on the old wooden floor as she tiptoed down the stairs. In the dim light of the hallway, she saw the rocking chair in the corner of the living room, gently moving back and forth, as though someone invisible was sitting in it. Her heart pounded, but she told herself it was just a draft or some trick of gravity. But as she stepped closer, the rocking slowed, then stopped. A chill washed over her as she felt the distinct impression of eyes watching her, as if someone, or something, was right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Trying to shake off the fear, she went back to bed, convinced she was only letting her imagination get the better of her. The next morning, she woke to find the chair in the center of the living room, facing the stairs. She hadn't left it there. Trying to ignore the unease creeping through her, she pushed it back to its corner. But that night, the creaking started again, louder this time, as though someone was rocking faster, more agitated. She pressed a pillow over her head, refusing to go back downstairs. Yet, as she lay there, she felt an overwhelming urge to look. When she finally worked up the nerve to go back downstairs, the chair was once again facing the stairs, but this time it was not empty. A figure sat there, a woman, hunched and skeletal, with long, matted hair that covered her face. Her hands, thin and bony, gripped the armrests tightly, her fingers tapping a steady rhythm against the wood. "Hello?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. The woman slowly raised her head, and Emily's heart nearly stopped. Her face was pale and lifeless, her eyes empty sockets staring blindly ahead, her mouth twisted into a grim, thin smile. She looked as though she'd been dead for years. "What do you want?" Emily choked out, backing away slowly. The figure's head tilted, her mouth opening, her voice like the creak of an old door. "This is my house." Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding as she turned and bolted up the stairs. She locked herself in her bedroom, her hands shaking as she pressed her back against the door, her mind racing. The next day, she tried to convince herself it was a hallucination, a result of stress and exhaustion. But she could feel the house's weight bearing down on her, the air thickening with each day. She became increasingly aware of footsteps on the stairs, voices whispering in empty rooms. Desperate, she went to the local library, searching for any information about her house. Finally, in an old, yellowed newspaper clipping, she found it, a story about a woman named Beatrice Hart, who had lived and died in that house in the early 1900s. She'd been a recluse, rumored to have dabbled in dark practices, and was said to have died alone in her rocking chair, waiting for her lost child who never returned. Emily's blood ran cold. The picture in the article looked eerily like the woman she'd seen. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt a pressure on her chest, as though someone were sitting on her, squeezing the air out of her lungs. She opened her eyes to see Beatrice's pale face looming over her, eyes hollow and unseeing, her mouth curled into that thin, unsettling smile. Emily couldn't move, couldn't scream. Beatrice's icy fingers trailed down her cheek, the touch cold and damp. "This is my house," Beatrice whispered, her voice crackling with fury. "Leave or stay with me. Forever." Emily broke free, gasping for air as she scrambled out of bed and ran. She didn't stop, barely grabbing her keys as she fled the house, stumbling into the night. The next day, she returned with a few friends, determined to grab her belongings and leave for good. But when they opened the door, they found the living room empty, her things strewn about as though she had never moved in. But the rocking chair, it sat in the middle of the room, facing the stairs, gently rocking back and forth, as if someone invisible was still waiting, watching. Emily never returned, but the neighbors say the light in the living room still turns on at night, and if you stand outside and listen, you can hear the soft, steady creak of a rocking chair, waiting for someone to come home. The small, rundown diner sat on the outskirts of town, perched on a lonely strip of road where barely any cars ever passed. People called it Jack's Place, even though nobody knew who Jack was. It was the kind of place where the lights flickered constantly, the coffee was always stale, and the few regulars were as old as the diner itself. Nora had just started her night shift, covering for her coworker who had called in sick. The place was empty, save for the occasional truck driver stopping in for a quick coffee and pie before hitting the road again. The clock above the counter ticked loudly in the silence as she wiped down tables and tried to stay awake. Then, around midnight, a man walked in. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked slightly off. His eyes were too wide, too bright, and his smile seemed stretched just a bit too far. Nora felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced a polite smile as he took a seat at the counter. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice sounding thin in the empty diner. The man nodded, never taking his eyes off her. She poured him a cup, the coffee swirling as he lifted it to his mouth and took a slow sip. His gaze remained steady, almost too intense. "Quiet night?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. "Yeah," she replied, keeping her tone friendly, though she felt unease prickling at the back of her neck. "What brings you out here?" he asked, still smiling that strange, too wide smile. "I'm just covering a shift," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't usually work nights." "Shame," he said, and for a second his eyes seemed to darken, his smile fading. "You seem just the right kind of person to work nights." Nora felt the chill deepen. She glanced at the clock. 12:15 a.m., only a few more hours until her shift ended. She just had to get through it. But something about the man felt wrong. She didn't know why, but she could feel it deep in her bones. "Excuse me a moment," she said, ducking into the kitchen under the pretense of grabbing something. She needed a minute to shake off the feeling, to collect herself. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. When she returned, the man was gone. She sighed with relief and looked out the window, expecting to see him heading to his car, but the lot was empty. Just the night and an endless stretch of road. As she turned back, her blood ran cold. The man's coffee cup was still there, but it was wrong. The inside of the cup was filled with something thick and dark like black ink, and the spoon, it was warped, twisted as though it had been melted. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible like distant whispers just beyond her range of hearing. She shivered, glancing around the diner, but everything was still. Shaking her head, she picked up the cup, intending to wash it out, but as soon as she touched it, an icy chill shot up her arm, freezing her in place. The hum grew louder, turning into a soft, repetitive whisper. "Come home! Come home!" She dropped the cup, gasping as it shattered on the floor. The sound was deafening in the empty diner, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The clock ticked loudly, and she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. "Nora!" The voice came from behind her, low and chilling. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The man was standing just outside the door, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes staring unblinkingly at her. But now, his face seemed wrong. His features were blurred, like a photograph that had been smudged, his smile too wide, stretching beyond the boundaries of his face. "Come home, Nora," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally through the glass. She stumbled back, her hands shaking as she tried to find something, anything, to defend herself. But when she looked again, he was gone. Only the faint outline of a handprint remained on the glass, smudged and dark. The doorbell chimed, making her jump, and she whirled around, but the diner was empty. Just the lingering scent of something foul and rotting, seeping into the air. She grabbed her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed the number of her coworker. The phone rang and rang until finally a voice answered. "Hello?" It was her coworker, but her voice sounded distant, distorted. "Lena, you have to come to the diner. Something's not right. A man, he." Nora trailed off, glancing around, her words catching in her throat. A pause, then her coworker's voice, lower and colder than it should have been, whispered, "Nora, we've been waiting for you. Come home." The line went dead, and Nora's heart stopped as she stared at her phone. Her coworker's number was gone. No recent calls, no contact saved, nothing. She felt the air grow colder, the hum returning, louder, and the whispers began to build, echoing in her mind. Frantically, she tried to leave, but when she reached the door, it wouldn't open. The lock was jammed, the glass fogging as though the temperature had dropped to freezing. The hum grew louder, now a chorus of whispers, all calling her name in a relentless, droning chant. "Come home! Come home!" The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls, stretching toward her. In the corner of her eye, she saw the man again, his face smudged and melting, his hand reaching out to her. Panicking, she turned and bolted for the back exit, throwing open the door and stumbling into the night air. She didn't stop running until she was down the road, gasping for breath as she turned back to look at the diner one last time. But it was gone. Where it had stood, there was only an empty patch of dirt, an abandoned lot with no sign of a building, no trace of the place she just escaped from. Just an old, faded sign sticking out of the ground that read, "Jack's Place, closed since 1973. Nora's heart sank as the whispers began again, faint but persistent, carried on the wind. She was alone on a desolate road with nothing but a whisper in her ear. "Come home, Nora. Come home."